servants who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king, and let the king appoint commissioners in all provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in the citadel of Susa, under custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women. Let their cosmetic treatments be given them, and let the young women who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This pleased the king, and he did so. Now there was a Jew in the citadel of Susa whose name was Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjaminite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives carried away with King Jeconiah of Judah, whom King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon had carried away. He brought up to Hadass, that is Esther, his cousin, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman was fair and beautiful, and when her father and mother died, Mordecai adopted her as his own daughter. When the king's order had edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in the citadel of Susa in custody of Haggai, Esther was taken into the king's palace and put into the custody of Haggai, who had charge of the women. The young woman pleased him and won his favor, and he quickly provided her with cosmetic treatments and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen maids from the king's palace. And he advanced her and her maids to be the best place in the harem. Esther did not reveal her people of kindred, for Mordecai had charged her not to tell. Every day Mordecai would walk back and forth in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and how she fared. Then turn came from each woman to go to King Ahasuerus, after being 12 months under the regulations for the women, since this was the regular period of cosmetic treatment, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with perfumes and cosmetics for women. When the young woman went into the king, she was given whatever she asked for to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she went in, and then in the morning she came back to the second harem in custody of Shazgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She did not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her and she was summoned by name. When the turn came for Esther, daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had adopted her as his own daughter, to go into the king, she asked for nothing except the Haggai, the king's eunuch, who had charged the women, who had charge of the women, advised. Now Esther was admired by all who saw her. When Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus in his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all the other women. Of all the virgins, she won his favor and devotion. So he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great banquet to all his officials and ministers, Esther's banquet. He also granted a holiday to the provinces and gave his royal liberty. Then from Luke, the walk to Emmaus. Now on that same day, 2 of them were going to the village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all the things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them. But their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still and said, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all people. And now our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body, they came back and told us that he indeed had seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him." May these readings from Esther and Luke inspire us to live for love.
Thanks be to God. In Lancaster, where I grew up, the county jail was on my walk home from high school. It wasn't set apart. It was on a city street, and I walked by it all the time. People would yell out. Some of those were, of course, catcalls, but some of them weren't. Occasionally, someone would visit by standing outside and yelling up across the razor wire and through the barred windows, seeing part of a face in shadow. A castle behind a barbed wire enclosure. There is something particular about the cruelty described in Esther. The young women gathered by King Ahasuerus were not taken to some remote dungeon, hidden away where their families could pretend they no longer existed. They were brought to the citadel of Susa, the palace complex that sat in the center of everything. Their fathers, brothers, neighbors could see the towers. And from inside, the women could likely see the rooftops of the homes they'd left behind. That's a specific kind of imprisonment. Not the prison of complete disappearance, but the prison of visibility without voice. Close enough to be seen, far enough away to be utterly silenced. Present in the landscape, absent from the conversation. This is the world into which Esther is gathered. She and all the other young women had no say in what happened to them. The text doesn't give us their grief, doesn't name their fear. It records their beauty treatments and the king's pleasure and moves on. The apparatus of the state swallows them, and the story is told as if this is simply how things work. Because for much of human history, it has been. If you recall from last week, Queen Vashti had refused a command to display herself before the king and his drunken visitors. Her no triggered a panic across the empire. The king was warned. If Vashti's refusal became known, every woman in the empire would begin to despise her husband. The queen's act of independence was treated as a contagion. The solution was not simply to punish Vashti, but to replace her with someone more compliant, and to issue a royal decree that every man should be master in his household. They wrote the law of female submission into the empire because one woman had said no. Esther's gathering into the harem is not incidental to this. It is the direct consequence. Vashti's refusal was erased, and the system set about finding someone who would not refuse. This is the architecture of control. Punish dissent, remove the dissenter, replace her with someone the system has already broken in, and insist no one ever dissented in the first place. Here, the text raises a question and then refuses to answer it directly. God is never mentioned in the book of Esther. Not once. There's no divine voice, no miraculous intervention, no angel at the door. And so we are left to ask, where is an all-powerful God when young women are being rounded up and deposited into a king's harem? This absence is not an accident. It is, I believe, a theological provocation. The book of Esther invites us to sit inside the experience of the marginalized, to feel what it is like when heaven seems silent, to feel what it is like when the righteous suffer, when power does what it wants, when the machinery of empire hums along and God does not appear to stop it. And this raises a deeper question. What kind of God do we need? Do we need a God who intervenes dramatically, reordering the political structures from above? Or do we need a God who works through people? through the courage of one woman who decides to risk her life, through the wisdom of a guardian who counsels her, through the slow accumulation of small, faithful acts inside an unjust system. The book of Esther answers quietly, both. Amen. But the one we meet here is the second kind. The God who is hidden in the action, present in the risk, working through human beings who could have done nothing and instead chose to do something. That God does not exempt us from trauma. That God does not avert the disaster. That God is present in the survival. And more than survival, in the possibility of transformation. Two texts, two citadels, one made of stone, one made of doubt. Turn now to the road to Emmaus. Two disciples are walking away from Jerusalem and a stranger joins them. He asks what they are discussing. They stop, heavy with grief. And Cleopas says, "Are you the only visitor in Jerusalem who doesn't know the things that have happened in these days?" What follows is remarkable. These disciples rehearse the story of Jesus, his life, his death, the women who'd gone to the tomb and found it empty and reported a vision of angels. And then they say something that has always struck me as the saddest line in this passage. Some of those with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but him they did not see. The women had testified, the disciples had investigated and confirmed the empty tomb, and still, the resurrection felt like an absence, a grief without resolution. Because the testimony of the women had not been fully received. It was checked, it was verified, and then it was set aside. The disciples on the road are carrying the wound of incomplete faith. Faith that investigated the facts and still could not believe the witnesses. Jesus is walking with them. They cannot see him. And this blindness is not simply supernatural, it is also something else. They are still looking for the wrong kind of Messiah. They expected someone who would redeem Israel through power. They got someone who redeemed through a life of saying yes to what was good and being condemned for the single, essential, existential no spoken to empire. And of course, they had been taught in 1,000 subtle ways not to trust the testimony of women. These two texts together name something we have rarely been honest about in the life of the church and in the life of civil society: the systematic construction of what I am calling the female fortress. The female fortress is the set of interlocking walls we build, institutional, theological, cultural, legal, that keeps women's voices from reaching the center of our decisions. Sometimes the walls are literal, like Esther's citadel. Sometimes they are procedural, like the rules about who may testify or preach or lead. Sometimes they are social, the soft ridicule that greets a woman who speaks too directly, asks too much, refuses to perform the social rituals of compliance, who refuses to sit still and look pretty. The female fortress is not usually built by monsters. Sometimes. Usually it's built by frightened people, frightened men. People like Ahasuerus' advisors who looked at one woman's no and saw the end of civilization. It's built by people who genuinely believe the order they are defending is the right order, the divine order. the only order that keeps everything from falling apart. But look at what the female fortress costs. It costs the empire Vashti, a queen capable of dignity and refusal, replaced by a system designed to prevent any such refusal again. It cost the disciples in Emmaus nearly everything. They walked away from Jerusalem carrying incomplete information because they had not fully heard the women who had already told them what had happened. It costs us right now in ways we are only beginning to calculate. We do not have to reach far to hear these stories in our own moment. Consider the ongoing global crisis of gender-based violence, the millions of women and girls taken, trafficked, killed, or silenced, their stories told as statistics, if they are told at all. Consider the women who have reported assault, abuse, or coercion and have not been believed, not because the evidence was absent, but because the systems we built were not designed to fully receive their testimony. Consider the rate at which women in this country are dying in childbirth, Black women in particular, at rates that constitute a public health crisis. Their pain dismissed in clinical settings, their warnings ignored, their bodies failed by institutions that didn't listen. Consider the global rise of authoritarian movements that, across ideological and geographic lines, share a common feature: the rollback of women's rights and the reassertion of old patriarchal hierarchies. The language changes, the structure doesn't. Consider closer to home the churches that have spent decades debating whether women may speak from the pulpit, while the world outside their doors burns with the need for every voice we have. Steph and I today were at the home of Joanna Lee, Mother Bethel AME. Mother Bethel is a liberation church, right? They walked away from racist Methodists and started something new and then refused to let Joanna Lee preach. These are not separate problems with separate solutions. They're variations on the same architecture. The female fortress, built stone by stone across centuries and maintained by our willingness to look away. When we dismiss, when we erase, when we round up and contain, we do not simply harm the individuals involved. We impoverish ourselves. Esther in the harem could not advise the king. Esther as queen, given voice and access by Mordecai's wisdom and her own extraordinary courage, saved a people. The women at the tomb saw the risen Christ first. The women at the tomb ran to tell. The disciples who filtered that testimony through their doubt carried confusion to Emmaus and nearly walked away from the resurrection itself. We do not know what the church would look like if women's testimony had been fully received from the beginning, but it's an interesting question. We do not know what therapies might exist, what conflicts might have been prevented, what wisdom might have shaped our policies and our liturgies and our laws if the female fortress had not been built or had been dismantled sooner or at all. Both of the story of Vashti and the crucifixion are stories about the lengths power will go to maintain itself. This kind of power is by nature parasitic. It will burn through anything else to grow itself. Round up all the women, crucify loving dissent, get rid of immigrants, take the world by force. We are living among the evidence of that loss. The cost of dismissiveness is not abstract. It's written in lives and in deaths. So you see, Even in describing the problem as the female fortress, I have participated in the game. Because it isn't the female fortress at all. It's the monument of patriarchy. The alternative might be right there in Mary's name. Some scholars believe that Magdalene is a title, translating to the tower. What if, rather than the female fortress being the tower in which women are imprisoned, it becomes the beacon, the lighthouse, the wisdom of women as our great strength? Making this switch in our hearts means believing testimony before we have independent verification. It means trusting that the women who went to the tomb are not hysterical with grief, that they saw what they said they saw. It means not waiting for Mordecai's network of confirmation before we act on what the women have already told us. This towering wisdom will prompt us to examine the fears that built the walls. Ahasuerus' advisors were afraid that Vashti's refusal would spread. They weren't wrong to notice that freedom is contagious. They were catastrophically wrong to respond with more control. Understanding why people act as they do is essential to offering alternatives to how people act. This towering wisdom insists upon interrogating our own structures. Who is gathered in the citadel of our organization? Who is visible but voiceless? Who can see the towers of power from their window but cannot get a seat at the table? And it means being willing to let the answers to those questions change us, and therefore change our choices. Because if the resurrection teaches us anything we can use every single day, it is that change is good. Here is the good news, and I want to be precise about it because it's not cheap comfort. The good news is not that God prevents the gathering of the women. The book of Esther is very honest. Esther was gathered. She was taken. The machinery of empire did what it did. The good news is that God does not abandon the gathered. That even inside the citadel, there is someone who has not been broken all the way down, someone who will one day walk into the throne room unsummoned and say, "If I perish, I perish." Someone who knows that their worth in the eyes of God is not diminished by their treatment in the world. The good news is that the women at the tomb were not wrong. The good news is that the stranger on the road to Emmaus is not a stranger. The good news is that the risen Christ chose to appear first to the people whose testimony was least likely to be believed, and that this choice was not incidental or accidental. It was the announcement of a new order. In that new order, the testimony of Mary Magdalene is not a rumor to be checked against other sources. It is the first proclamation of the gospel coming from the Tower of Wisdom. We're still slow to build that new order. We continue to prefer the empire's logic dressed up in the church's language. And the cost is the difference between living in prisons we make for ourselves and living in the resurrecting kingdom of the living God. Beloved, the risen Christ is loose in the world. As our DS Karen Monk put it this week, it's the Easter season. For 50 days, there's a Messiah on the loose. I love that. And he's walking on the road to wherever people are carrying their grief and their doubt, walking with them, asking questions, opening the scriptures, offering the keys to the kingdom. Until they turn the key and leave the walls behind. Many of us are imprisoned not in a far off place, but right in the center of things. Watched but not seen, displayed but not known, performing but not present. If you've been gathered into the citadel, taken, silenced, dismissed, erased, know that the God of Esther is present in your survival and is not finished with your story. If you've been one of the disciples who checked the testimony and then set it aside, there's still a road, and there is still a stranger walking beside you, and it is not too late to have your eyes opened. If you have benefited from the female fortress without building it, the question before you is the same one before every generation that inherits unjust structures. What will you do with what you have inherited? The text doesn't let us simply admire Esther from a distance. It asks, for such a time as this, your time, this moment, what are you willing to risk? The citadel is visible. The testimony has been given. The road is long, and Christ is on it.